The town laughed at their cave garden until all other crops froze. They called it a tomb before they ever saw a single sprout rise from the dust. To the residents of Granite Creek, the purchase of the hollowed-out limestone recess on the northern ridge was an act of financial disaster, if not a sign of outright madness. The year was 1883, and the Wyoming Territory did not suffer fools kindly, nor did it offer mercy to those who sought to bend the iron laws of its winter. Arthur and Mary, a couple possessing more grit than currency, had arrived late in the season, pulling a wagon that creaked under the weight of books on botany and a silence that unnerved the boisterous locals. They did not buy the fertile bottomland near the river, where the soil was black and deep but prone to the sweeping floods of spring. Instead, they took the deed to the Devil's Throat, a jagged scar in the hillside that faced due south, a geological oddity that the town elders claimed was good for nothing but sheltering rattlesnakes and broken dreams. Arthur stood at the mouth of the cave, his boots crunching on the scree, looking out over the valley that was slowly turning the brown and gold of late autumn. He was a man of few words, built with the lean, tensile strength of rawhide, his mind operating with the precision of a surveyor's level. Beside him, Mary, small but possessed of a terrifyingly efficient energy, kicked a loose stone into the darkness of the cavern. They were not looking at the darkness. They were calculating angles of incidence and thermal retention. While the town saw a hole in the ground, Arthur and Mary saw a battery. The physics of the situation were undeniable to them, even if invisible to the rest. The sun, traveling its lower arc in the coming winter, would strike this southern face directly, while the massive limestone overhang would act as a shield against the biting northern winds. It was a gamble on geometry, a wager placed on the specific heat capacity of stone versus the brutality of an open prairie. The skepticism began in earnest 3 days later at Henderson's General Store. The bell above the door jingled, cutting through the thick haze of pipe smoke and the low murmur of men discussing the plunging price of cattle. When Arthur placed his order on the counter, the silence in the room became heavy, pressing in against the couple like the atmospheric pressure before a storm. He did not ask for salted pork or sacks of flour to wait out the freeze. He asked for seeds. He requested cold hardy varieties, kale, spinach, carrots, and turnips. He asked for sheets of oiled paper and translucent mica. Henderson, a man whose face was etched with the map of 60 harsh winters, peered over his spectacles, his mustache twitching with suppressed mirth. The request was so absurd, so antithetical to the rhythm of the frontier, that he thought it a joke. Men did not plant in November. The ground was already hardening, the frost knitting the soil into a bruised, impenetrable mat. To put a seed in the ground now was to murder it. "Son," Henderson said, his voice grating like a rusted hinge, loud enough for the men by the stove to hear. "I'll take your coin, certainly, but you might as well throw those seeds into the fire yonder. The ground is locking up. By next moon, the soil will be hard enough to break a pickaxe. You aim to farm rocks in a blizzard?" The men by the stove erupted into chortles, slapping their knees and shaking their heads. They mocked the city logic that Arthur represented, the arrogance of thinking one could outsmart the seasons. One rancher, a man named Garrett with hands the size of shovels, leaned back and spat into the spittoon. "Let him be, Henderson," Garrett called out. "Maybe he plans to feed the bats. I hear cave-grown turnips taste like pure limestone." The laughter followed them out the door, a chorus of ridicule that might have broken weaker spirits. But as they loaded their supplies onto the wagon, Mary only tightened her shawl. She didn't look back at the warm glow of the store. She looked toward the ridge, her eyes focusing on the thermodynamics of the task ahead. They had the skepticism of the community. Now they needed the soil. The construction process was not the frantic, desperate scratching of survivalists, but the methodical execution of engineers. For 3 weeks, Arthur and Mary became beasts of burden, moving with a rhythmic, tireless persistence that baffled the few observers who rode by the ridge. The cave floor was uneven stone, useless for roots. To solve this, they did not just till the earth, they imported it. They spent 10 days hauling wagon loads of river muck, rich with silt and decaying organic matter, mixing it by hand with sand and horse manure they had collected from the very town that mocked them. They were manufacturing a microbiome. The labor was backbreaking. Arthur would swing the mattock to level the cave floor, the clang of steel on stone ringing out across the valley, while Mary sifted the soil, removing rocks and debris until the mixture was fine and aerated. They created raised beds, not of wood, but of stacked stone found on site. Stone was the critical element. Arthur knew that stone held heat. By building the retaining walls of the garden beds out of dark basalt and granite, they were creating thermal sinks. During the day, the low winter sun would pour into the mouth of the cave, striking these dark stones in the black soil. The energy would be absorbed, stored within the dense mass of the rock. At night, when the outside air dropped to lethal temperatures, the stones would slowly release that stored heat, radiating it back into the soil and the air trapped within the cave. It was the principle of thermal mass, a concept as old as the earth itself, applied with surgical precision. They worked from dawn until the last dregs of twilight faded, their breath steaming in the cooling air, their hands raw and blistered, accompanied only by their old blue heeler, Barnaby, who sat watch at the cave entrance, his ears twitching at the wind. Once the beds were laid, 3 long rows extending 20 feet back into the cavern, the true engineering began. The cave mouth was too wide, too open to the vacuum of the night. They needed to create a greenhouse effect without glass, which was too expensive and too fragile to transport. Arthur used the oiled paper and mica sheets, framing them into large, sturdy panels using timber he had hewn from the sparse pine grove nearby. They did not seal the cave entirely. That would invite mold and suffocate the plants. Instead, Arthur constructed a slanted vestibule, angled at 45 degrees to catch the maximum amount of southern light while deflecting the wind up and over the ridge. The installation of these panels was a delicate dance of leverage and friction. They wedged the frames into the limestone, sealing the gaps with a mortar of clay and straw. When they were finished, the mouth of the cave looked like a jagged eye covered in a cataract, opaque and strange. But inside, the difference was immediate. Step past the paper wall, and the biting wind vanished. The air was still. It carried the scent of wet earth and manure, a heavy, humid perfume that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, dry scent of the coming winter outside. It was a microclimate, a pocket of resistance against the atmospheric violence of the territory. The skeptics in town saw only a strange, boarded-up hole in the hill. They did not know that Arthur and Mary had essentially built a lung, a structure that breathed in light and held on to heat with the desperation of a miser clutching gold. Planting day was silent and reverent. The calendar read late November. The rest of the territory was gray, the trees skeletal, the grass matted and dead. Yet, inside the devil's throat, Mary pressed her thumb into the soft, dark loam, making rows of small indentations. She dropped the seeds, kale, chard, carrots, beets, into the earth with a prayer not to God, but to biology. They watered the beds with water hauled from the creek, carefully tempered near their small iron stove so as not to shock the seeds. The contrast was jarring. Outside, the temperature hovered near freezing at high noon. Inside the cave, thanks to the greenhouse effect and the thermal mass of the surrounding tons of rock, the thermometer read a balmy 55 degrees. The germination was the first victory, though no one but them saw it. A week after planting, tiny loops of green broke the surface of the black soil. In the dim, diffused light filtering through the oiled paper, the plants looked neon bright, almost alien against the gray stone walls. Arthur monitored the temperature obsessively. He kept a logbook, noting the outside temperature versus the inside. He noted that even when the valley floor dipped to 20 degrees, the cave held at 45. The earth deep inside the cave was a constant 50 degrees, radiating warmth up through the bottom of the planting beds. They were tapping into the geothermal constant, using the planet's own crust as a blanket. While the townspeople huddled around their wood stoves, eating dried beans and tough venison, fresh life was unfurling in the dark. But the true test was not the cold of November. The true test was the wolf moon, the deep, crushing freeze of January that the locals whispered about with dread. The weather began to turn in mid-December. The skies over the mountains to the west turned the color of bruised iron. The wind shifted, coming no longer from the west, but dropping down from the Arctic north, screaming across the plains without a single tree to break its momentum. The pressure dropped so rapidly that Arthur could feel it in his ears, a physical weight pressing down on the landscape. The animals felt it first. Deer moved down from the high country, huddled in thickets. Birds vanished. The town of Granite Creek battened down. Shutters were nailed shut. Firewood was stacked high. Henderson, at the general store, watched the barometer fall and shook his head. "Going to be a killer," he muttered to the empty room. "Hope that city boy and his wife dug decent graves in that cave of theirs. Ground's going to be too hard to bury 'em by Tuesday." The mockery had turned to a grim sort of pity. In the eyes of the town, Arthur and Mary were already casualties, victims of their own arrogance, soon to be frozen stiff in their foolish rock garden. They did not understand that the couple was not fighting the cold, they were diverting it. As the first snowflakes began to fall, hard, dry pellets that hissed like sand, Arthur and Mary were inside the cave, lighting small tallow candles between the rows of kale. The tiny flames added just a fraction of heat, but in the enclosed physics of the cave, every calorie counted. They sat on the stone ledge, wrapped in wool, watching the green leaves tremble slightly in the draft, waiting for the whiteout that would bury the world. The storm was not just weather, it was a verdict, approaching with the inevitability of a glacier. The blizzard arrived not as a weather event, but as a geological force, a physical wall of white that slammed into the Granite Creek Valley with the concussive force of an avalanche. For 72 hours, the world ceased to exist beyond the reach of one's own arm. The wind screamed at a pitch that vibrated the teeth in one's skull, a relentless, atonal shriek that drove men to sit in corners with their hands over their ears. In the town, the structures of wood and nail, the pride of civilization, groaned under the assault. Clapboards were ripped from frames like wet paper. Shingles became deadly projectiles vanishing into the whiteout. The cold was an active, predatory presence. It sought out cracks in the chinking of the cabins, finding the smallest gaps to insert its icy fingers. Inside the devil's throat, however, the sensation was entirely different. The storm was a furious, abstract painting pressing against the oiled paper and mica screens, but the violence remained external. The aerodynamics of the vestibule Arthur had constructed performed exactly as the physics dictated. The 45-degree angle did not fight the wind, but guided it upward, the air current rushing over the lip of the cave rather than slamming into it. This created a pocket of low pressure at the entrance, a suction that actually helped seal the frames tighter against the rock face rather than blowing them in. Inside the cave, the silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic breathing of Barnaby and the soft hiss of the tallow candles. Arthur and Mary moved through their subterranean garden with the hushed reverence of monks in a library. The temperature differential was staggering. Outside, the mercury had retreated into the bulb, registering 30 degrees below zero, a temperature where exposed flesh froze in seconds. Inside, the thermal mass of the limestone, Hundreds of tons of rock that had spent the last 3 months soaking up the southern sun began to pay its dividend. The walls radiated a dry, steady warmth. It was the principle of the battery discharging. The stone floors, insulated from the frozen ground by the layers of trapped air in the raised beds, held the heat. The thermometer in the cave hovered at 42 degrees. It was not hot, but it was survivable. It was life. The plants sensed the drop in light, slowing their respiration, but they did not freeze. The kale leaves, dark and crinkled, stood rigid and pressurized with water, defiant against the entropy occurring just 10 feet away. Mary walked the rows, draping wool blankets over the most delicate chard during the darkest hours of the night, treating the vegetables not as food, but as kin. They were alone in the belly of the mountain, while the world outside died. When the wind finally died down on the morning of the 4th day, it left behind a landscape scoured clean of familiarity. The drifts were 10 feet high against the windward side of buildings. The sky cleared to a piercing, cruel blue, offering no warmth, only a blinding illumination of the disaster. In Granite Creek, the silence that followed the howl was the silence of ruin. Men dug themselves out of their homes with desperation, tunneling through snow that had packed as hard as sandstone. The damage assessment began immediately, and it was catastrophic. The wolf moon had lived up to its name. It had devoured the town's reserves. The extreme drop in temperature had penetrated the shallow root cellars that most families relied on. It was a failure of tradition. The settlers had built cellars based on the mild winters of Kentucky or Missouri, not the deep freeze of the high territory. Henderson stood in the wreckage of his store's storage annex, holding a potato that was as hard as a river stone. He dropped it, and it shattered on the floor like glass. The entire stock, sacks of potatoes, barrels of apples, crates of onions, was ruined. The cellars had not been deep enough, and they lacked the thermal mass to resist the 3-day soak of 30 below cold. The frost line had plunged 4 feet into the earth, turning the food stores into necrotic black mush that would rot the moment it thawed. Reports from the ranchers were equally grim. Garrett rode into town on a horse that looked skeletal, its breath pluming in the frigid air. He reported that half his herd was gone, frozen standing up in the fields where they had huddled for warmth. The haystacks had been blown apart and buried. The town of Granite Creek was facing a famine in the middle of January. There was no way to bring supplies in. The passes would be blocked until April. The mockery that had permeated the general store months ago was replaced by a hollow, terrified quiet. They realized collectively that their sensible methods had failed against the absolute indifference of the Wyoming winter. 2 days after the storm broke, a small party formed outside the general store. It was a grim procession, armed with spades and pickaxes, led by Garrett and Henderson. They were not going to the ridge to gloat. They were going to perform a civic duty. "We have to go check on the city folk," Garrett said, his voice rough. "They're likely dead. If the wind didn't blow that contraption off the hill, the cold surely finished them. We can't leave them up there for the wolves." The men nodded, pulling their coat collars up. They expected to find 2 frozen corpses in a cave filled with snow. They trudged up the winding trail, their breath laboring in the thin, icy air. The ascent was brutal, the snow shifting underfoot. But as they rounded the final switchback that brought the Devil's Throat into view, they stopped dead in their tracks. The cave was not a snow-filled tomb. The angled vestibule was intact, the oiled paper frames standing taut and resilient. But it was what they saw, or rather what they didn't see, that confused them. There was no snow piled in front of the entrance. The aerodynamic shape had scoured the stone clean, and the panels, they were glowing. The mid-morning sun was hitting the translucent mica and oil-soaked paper, making the entrance shine with a diffused golden luminosity. It looked like a lantern set into the side of the mountain. Garrett squinted, rubbing his eyes. "Is that smoke?" he asked. A thin wisp of steam was venting from a small pipe near the top of the frame. It wasn't smoke, it was condensation. It was the breath of the cave. The men exchanged glances, the weight of their shovels suddenly feeling very heavy and very presumptuous. They approached slowly, the crunch of their boots on the scree the only sound. Barnaby, the blue heeler, barked from inside, a sharp, healthy sound that echoed against the canyon walls. It was not the bark of a dying animal. Arthur opened the door before they could knock. He stepped out into the blinding white, wearing only a flannel shirt and a vest, while the townspeople were bundled in buffalo coats. The blast of air that escaped the cave when the door opened hit the men in the face. It was warm, humid, and smelled impossibly of damp earth and crushed greenery. It was the smell of June in the middle of January. Henderson's jaw went slack. He looked past Arthur through the open frame and saw it. The sun was streaming onto the raised stone beds. The kale was a vibrant, deep emerald. The carrots were plumed with lacy green tops. The condensation dripped from the ceiling like a spring rain. It was a cathedral of chlorophyll. We came to dig graves," Garrett stammered, his bravado utterly dissolved by the visual evidence of the miracle. "We thought you were frozen stiff." Arthur looked at the men, then at the shovels in their hands. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer a rebuke. He simply understood the physics of their situation. They were cold, they were hungry, and their rigid adherence to tradition had left them caloric deficient. "No graves today," Arthur said, his voice calm, lacking any trace of the "I told you so" that he had every right to deliver. "But the harvest is ready. We have more greens than we can eat, and the root vegetables are crowding the beds. Come inside. Close the door behind you. You're letting the heat out." The meal that followed was eaten in a stupor of disbelief. Crowded into the back of the cave, sitting on the warm stone retaining walls, the most powerful men of Granite Creek ate raw carrots with the desperation of starving children. The snap of the fresh vegetable, the explosion of sweet, earthy juice, was a shock to palates that had known only salt pork and dried beans for months. Mary passed around a basket of kale and beet greens, and the men ate the leaves by the handful. It wasn't just food, it was medicine. The fresh vitamins flooded their systems, waking up senses dulled by the winter gray. Garrett sat looking at the stone wall, his hand resting on the granite that was warm to the touch. He finally understood. "It's the rock," he whispered, looking at Arthur. "It ain't the paper. It's the rock. You made the mountain hold the sun for you." Arthur nodded, sharpening his knife to harvest more turnips. "Thermal mass," Arthur said simply. "The sun is a fuel source. The stone is the storage tank. We just built a lid to keep it from leaking." Henderson, wiping a smear of dirt from his mouth, looked at the young couple with a new expression. Not just respect, but awe. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the coin purse he had guarded so jealously at the store. "I charged you double for those nails," he admitted, his voice low. "I want to pay it back. And I want to buy every pound of greens you can spare for the town. The children, they need this." The cave garden of Granite Creek did not just save the town that winter. It changed the architecture of the territory. The survival of the town through the rest of the winter was dependent on the weekly wagon runs up to the Devil's Throat. Arthur and Mary became the unlikely saviors, dispensing turnips and chard like communion wafers to a converted congregation. But the legacy extended far beyond that single season. When the thaw finally came in April, the town did not go back to the old ways. The skepticism had been frozen out of them. In the years that followed, the northern ridge of the valley underwent a transformation. It was no longer a barren slope of scree. Under Arthur's guidance, families began to buy up the useless rocky overhangs. They built into the hillsides, using stone and earth berms to insulate their homes and barns. The Devil's Throat design, south-facing orientation, thermal mass walls, and angled glazing became the vernacular architecture of the region. They stopped fighting the wind and started deflecting it. They stopped fearing the cold and started capturing the sun. Arthur and Mary lived on the ridge for 40 years. They never became cattle barons or gold tycoons, but they were rich in a way that mattered more in the high country. They were secure. The story of the Wolf Moon became a local legend, passed down not as a tall tale, but as a lesson in the curriculum of survival. The epilogue of their lives was written in the landscape itself. Long after they passed, the remnants of the original stone beds remained in the cave, a monument to the moment when competence triumphed over custom. The town of Granite Creek flourished, known throughout the West not for its gold or its cattle, but for the strange green jewels that grew in the dark of winter. Proof that with enough engineering, even a tomb could be turned into a garden.